You're listening to The Girl in the Girly Dress Who Loved Drug Dealers, a comedic memoir with business wisdom by me. This is Chapter 3. The Weed Man Who Accidentally Taught Me Negotiation. Nobody sat me down and said, "Let me teach you about negotiation." I wish they had. It would have saved me a lot of time, undercharging and emotional labor later. Instead, I learned it the way I learned most things back then, by watching. Quietly, absorbing everything while pretending I wasn't. And here's something I need to say clearly before we go any further. This wasn't just one man. These lessons came from patterns I observed across multiple relationships, different men, different cities, different circumstances, but the same fundamental principles showing up again and again. Some of these stories blend together. Some details have been changed to protect people, both innocent and guilty, but the lessons, those are real. And the negotiation lesson was one of the most powerful. The Puerto Rican music producer was one of the clearest examples. When I first started seeing him move product, he sold everything. Dime bags, dubs, whatever people wanted, he'd accommodate. But over time, I watched him shift. First, he stopped selling dime bags altogether. "Not worth my time," he said simply when someone asked. No apology, no explanation, just a boundary. Then he moved to eighths and higher only. Then eventually he only sold ounces and quarter pounds. And people adjusted. They didn't argue. They didn't guilt him. They didn't try to negotiate him down. They just adapted to his terms. That fascinated me. Because I had been raised to believe that business was about accommodation, that success meant making yourself available, that good service meant saying yes. But he showed me something different. Scarcity creates value. The less accessible he became, the more people wanted access. The higher his minimums, the more serious his clientele became. He wasn't chasing customers, he was cultivating the right customers. And that shift, watching him raise his standards and watching his business improve because of it, changed something in my brain. These men didn't talk much when it came to business, which in hindsight was lesson number one. They didn't explain themselves. They didn't justify their prices. They didn't argue. They didn't get defensive. And they simply stated things and waited, and people complied. At first, I thought it was confidence. Then I thought it was intimidation. But eventually, I realized it was something far more powerful. They knew their value. I watched them turn people down without raising their voices. No attitude, no apology, just a calm, "Nah, that doesn't work for me." And that was it. No back and forth. No over-explaining. No emotional spirals about being misunderstood. Just boundaries. That blew my mind. One pattern I noticed across almost all of them, they used silence and movement as negotiation tools. If a deal wasn't going their way, they didn't argue. They got up and walked out. No drama, no threats, no explanation, just movement. And every single time it worked. Either the other person would chase them, adjust their offer, or the deal would just die, and they'd be unbothered either way. That's what made it so effective. They genuinely didn't need any particular deal to close. They had options. They had other buyers. They had confidence in their product and their reputation. And that confidence was the real currency. I remember being nearby during these interactions, sometimes in the car, sometimes in another room, sometimes right there but invisible. If I was close enough and they walked, I followed. No questions, just movement. Other times I wasn't allowed in the room at all. "Stay here," they'd say. And that was non-negotiable. Not because they didn't trust me, but because some conversations weren't mine to be in. And I respected that. And because even their boundaries with me were a form of negotiation, a form of protection, a form of structure. Meanwhile, I was the type of woman who would explain herself into exhaustion. I believed if I just clarified enough, softened enough, accommodated enough, things would work out. I didn't want to be misunderstood, so I over-explained constantly in relationships, in friendships, in work situations, in casual interactions. I would preemptively apologize for boundaries I hadn't even set yet. I would offer discounts no one asked for. I would justify my decisions before anyone questioned them. And watching these men move through the world so differently, so unbothered by the possibility of being misunderstood, was uncomfortable at first. Because they didn't care, not in a cruel way, just in a self-assured way. They didn't have the education I had. They weren't trained in corporate communication or conflict resolution or emotional intelligence frameworks. And maybe that's exactly why they were better at it than me. They didn't overthink. They didn't try to manage everyone's feelings. They didn't confuse kindness with weakness. They just knew what they would and wouldn't accept, and they moved accordingly. I remember sitting in a car once journaling after watching another negotiation fall apart and rebuild itself within minutes. The guy had wanted a better price, pushed a little too hard, got a little too comfortable, and the man I was with didn't argue back. He just looked at him, stayed quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable, then said, "Aight, man, I'ma catch you later," and started packing his bag. The shift in energy was immediate. Wait, hold up," the guy said, backtracking. "I'm just saying." But my guy didn't engage. He just kept moving, slowly, calmly, not angry, not offended, just done. And within 30 seconds, the deal was back on at the original price. I sat there thinking, he didn't say a single word to defend himself, and he won. That night, smoking alone in my apartment, I wrote in my journal, "Negotiation isn't about convincing people, it's about deciding what you will and won't accept." And then underneath it, I negotiate against myself constantly. Why? That question stayed with me. I started seeing the pattern everywhere, in how I priced my time when people asked for favors, in how I justified my needs in relationships, in how I softened my boundaries before anyone even tested them. I was my own worst negotiator, and the more I slowed down, the more I sat with weed and reflection and honesty, the more I saw it. I didn't trust my own value enough to let it stand on its own. That was the real issue. Not that I didn't know my worth, but that I didn't believe other people would see it unless I convinced them. These men never tried to convince anyone. They just were. And that beingness was more persuasive than any pitch could ever be. The first time I tried the walkaway method, I was terrified. It was a business deal, nothing illegal, just a service I was offering. The potential client wanted to negotiate my rate down. They gave me all the reasons why they couldn't afford my price, why it was too high, why I should consider their budget. And I felt the old instinct rise up. Explain, justify, accommodate, make it work. But then I remembered. I remembered watching those men pack their bags and leave. I remembered the silence. I remembered the lack of defensiveness. So I took a breath and said, "I understand. Unfortunately, that rate doesn't work for me, but I appreciate you reaching out." And I stopped talking. No justification, no negotiation, no, "let me see what I can do." Just a boundary. The client paused, then countered, "What if we met in the middle?" I stayed quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm firm on my rate, but I'm happy to revisit this if your budget changes." Another pause. Then, "You know what? Let's do it. Your rate is fine." And just like that, the deal closed at my price. I hung up the phone and sat there stunned. It worked. The walkaway worked. Not because I was aggressive, not because I was manipulative, but because I trusted my value enough to let the deal die if it needed to. And that trust, that willingness to lose the deal rather than compromise myself, was what made the deal happen. Marijuana, during this phase, became less about escape and more about observation. I'd sit quietly, high, notebook nearby, brain making connections I didn't even realize were business related yet. I wasn't dreaming, I was decoding. I'd replay interactions, study patterns, notice where I gave too much, explained too much, softened too much, and slowly I started correcting course. Not perfectly, not immediately, but intentionally. I started practicing silence. I started practicing walking away, literally and figuratively. I started practicing the phrase, "that doesn't work for me." No apology attached, no explanation required, just honesty. Here's the business lesson that emerged fully formed. You can admire someone's skill and still outgrow their role in your life. I wasn't meant to be a partner in that world, but I was meant to take that lesson with me. Years later, when I started pricing my services, when I stopped apologizing for my expertise, when I learned to say no without panic, that was them. That was those moments. That was the weed men who accidentally taught me negotiation without ever knowing they were training a future CEO. And while I didn't stay in their world, I carried their discipline into mine. Not the chaos, not the risk, not the illegality, but the self-trust, the boundaries, the refusal to negotiate against myself. That was the gift, and I've been using it ever since. Thank you for listening. If this chapter resonated with you, I'd love to hear how it made you feel. You can share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to support this work, you can pre-order the book using the link in the comments.